To summarise, business in Vietnam is conducted in a very respectful manner, with punctuality being paramount, otherwise it is seen as being rude. Gift giving is also common to show respect to your counterparts, as well as maintaining good body language and eye contact throughout. They highly value the amount of respect they feel and are given at first. They are often suspicious and tentative when starting a new business relation and can often take them time to feel and build trust with another counterpart. In terms of their business culture, they are part of a collectivist society where they put the needs of the groups or community ahead of the opinion or need of the business. This could often lead to poor business growth in the long run, however, by acting in a collectivist manner further shows their respectfulness, especially when also reluctant to criticise others in business and often use silence as a method to indicate when something is wrong. More will be spoken about a collectivist society on the upcoming slides. To round off, what is clear to see is the differences between Vietnam in both etiquette and culture of business and how it is conducted compared to the UK. This will be highlighted further again in the further slides. However, what is very significant about doing business within or with Vietnamese is that the respect you show and the professional manner you conduct yourself in will always be acknowledged, in which case a relation in business is more easily formed.
The UK scores 89 on Hofstede's Insights, making it one of the most individualistic cultures in the world. In Britain, people are encouraged to focus on themselves and push for personal achievements, whereas in Vietnam, success is attributed to the collective efforts of a group or a community. The core differences which separate these cultures could be a sense of tension for Vietnamese and British employees when they're trying to work collaboratively. The biggest hurdle for any manager who is attempting to integrate an individualistic-born company with a collectivist one is the managing style and how work and tasks are delegated to employees. Britain sits on the lower spectrum of the Power Distance Index ranking. This is accounted for by the fact that the British culture prefers to minimise inequalities between people and working practices. Vietnam, on the other hand, scores high on this dimension with a score of 70. This means that a hierarchical order is adopted in which everybody knows and accepts their role with no further justification. In Vietnamese cultures, hierarchies have inherent qualities. The ideal workplace is a centralized structure where subordinates expect to be given directions as to what to do, and the ideal manager is a benevolent autocrat. In the UK, challenges to leadership and authority are more acceptable, and suggestions for people made in higher positions of power by their subordinates is usually welcome.
Charles Handy's model of organisational culture isn't exclusive to each nation. In fact, it depends on the organisation in the country. However, it is often noticeable of certain cultures to sway towards one of Handy's models. In the UK, we would say that most organisations tend to be a role-orientated culture, where power comes from those individuals higher in the chain of command in the business. This tends to be managers and directors, and these are the individuals making the decisions in the day-to-day running of the organisation. Vietnam's business model of organisational culture is similar to that of the UK, with predominantly role-type organisations. Though a difference between the two countries would be that in the UK there is a lower percentage of role culture jobs than in Vietnam. This is to do with the power distance mentioned previously. This means it is more unlikely to have task models of culture being present, as there is greater power distances between those employees lower down in an organisation, meaning that for employees to be working in teams is quite unlikely in Vietnamese business. Another reason for different organisational cultural models is the main industries in each country. In the UK, the financial sector is massive with lots of highly educated individuals working in these jobs. However, in Vietnam, electronics manufacturing brings in 24% of the nation's GDP. These types of jobs in electronics do not tend to require the same educational background to work in. This greatens the power distance and creates a more role culture, as individuals in Vietnam will find it difficult to climb the chain of command, as they don't have the necessary qualifications and education to do so.
Considering all the information we have gathered so far, we can now put this into practice through practical application and predict any potential outcomes. An example scenario is a business meeting between a British businessman representing the SME and a Vietnamese businessman. Problems and obstacles can easily occur which may hinder any agreement or discussions. For example, an obvious potential problem is the language barrier. Vietnamese people have their own language, as discussed in slide 2, and so information may get lost in translation and discussions can be hard to proceed if this isn't addressed properly. Furthermore, if you enter the meeting in an insensitive way, such as improper greeting or having poor punctuality, you may cause disrespect. As slide 2 highlights the importance this is to Vietnamese culture, particularly with regards to business. These problems can be avoided to ensure business is uninterrupted and proceed. Firstly, a translator could be essential to overcome the language barrier, as they can make sure information is accurate and no details are lost in translation. Secondly, proper research and professionalism can prevent any unknowing disrespect of the culture and interests, as slide 2 points out how Vietnamese people prioritise community impacts before business, and they take time to build relationships as they are cautious at the beginning of discussions. By adjusting to these interests, Vietnamese businessmen will feel more comfortable, which will encourage proceedings. Although these extra steps may be time and financially costly, it will help overcome any problems and ensure business is successful.
To look at some other practical differences between the UK and Vietnamese culture, we can first look at office relationships. In the UK, people tend to prefer formal meetings in which to engage in business activities. While you're at work, you're working, and it's fairly commonplace for employees to avoid building close relationships with each other. In Vietnam, instead of keeping relationships strictly professional, personal sharing and the development of closer long-term bonds is favoured and encouraged. There's a desire to form relationships with colleagues, something which requires time and trust to create, and individuals can often feel offended or ashamed if others do not reciprocate. Efforts to develop these relationships are commonplace. For example, activities such as karaoke are a perfect example of after-work engagement between colleagues. When it comes to authority, in particular reprimanding staff, in the UK, calling people out on their mistakes is pretty standard. In fact, it's often seen as an important part of developing a strong and effective team. Tackling problems head-on and letting colleagues know about their shortfalls or errors is totally acceptable, though the way you do so may vary between territories. In Vietnam, criticising a workmate in front of other members of the team is practically unthinkable. People will try to avoid these sorts of situations as much as possible. In fact, if there's any way to do away with unpleasant circumstances altogether, this is the preferred route to take. In Vietnam, for example, the concept of saving face sits at the core of the culture. Criticism is reserved for private interactions and is often delivered through a third party. In general, populations in the East are more reserved and don't readily expose their emotions. Maintaining harmony and avoiding conflict is considered an essential aspiration to uphold. When it comes to punctuality, it goes without saying being on time for work or work-related engagement is a big part of corporate culture both in the East and West. Nobody likes to wait around for someone else to arrive, and it's generally considered rude and unprofessional to be tardy. In the UK, local norms can be challenging, even between Westerners of different origins. Though people try to arrive at a designated time and start meetings without much delay, it's become more and more commonplace to adhere to flexible hours. In this context, as long as the work gets done and meetings are attended, no problem. The expectation that other team members are reliable. Furthermore, as we discovered in the previous section, if someone proves not to be reliable, they'll soon be called out on it. In Vietnam, punctuality isn't quite as clear-cut. The higher and more powerful a person is, the less important it is that they are prompt. It is totally acceptable for management to be late to a meeting, but less so for workers with lower ranks. Nevertheless, arriving late to the office or to a meeting in Asia may well pass without comment. There is an assumption that you had a good reason, so expect to be queried on what the reason was once the meeting is over. To address the brief and conclude this report, we recommend that the SME in question does outsource its production to Vietnam. Business in Vietnam is conducted in a very respectful manner, with punctuality being paramount, otherwise it's seen as being rude. This means we can expect a high degree of reliability in regard to production deadlines being met, hopefully leading to no hold-ups and disruption in lead times. Vietnam's emphasis on group work fosters an environment with collective pressure for success and collective actions. This is advantageous to the SME as it encourages a hard-working and dedicated workforce, ideally leading to the maximum production output being met, along with a high degree of consistency and overall productivity. Vietnam's adoption of a hierarchical order in which people in working practices understand their position on the power spectrum means that their culture is more suited to high-output, low-skill, labour-intensive outputs. This, combined with their generally lower wage expectations due to the lower cost of living, makes it ideal for the SME in question to outsource to in order to save both resources and expenses. This synergizes with Vietnam's model of organizational culture with predominantly role-type organizations. To put it simply, acceptance of a role culture by workers enables a workforce that is suited to somewhat repetitive and labour-intensive production tasks, something which is harder to come across in the UK. To conclude, we do indeed recommend that the SME in question offshores production to Vietnam to take advantage of all the cultural factors mentioned earlier that enable low-cost, high-efficiency production.